Just now, the story unfolding behind palace walls is not the one the public has been told. According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of internal royal briefings, a quiet but consequential reversal is underway, centered on Prince Harry, U.S. residency status, and a private appeal that has sent shockwaves through Windsor and beyond. What was once framed as a permanent departure is now reportedly being reconsidered under intense institutional pressure. Sources say this is no longer merely a family dispute. It has escalated into a matter of constitutional optics, legal exposure, and royal precedent, issues that reach far beyond personal reconciliation. At the heart of it all is a single destabilizing question being debated in sealed rooms. Can the monarchy absorb Harry's return without absorbing the consequences of Meghan's shadow? And according to insiders, time is no longer on Harry's side. The first signal that something had shifted did not come from California, nor from a public statement, but from London. Sources say that within the last 48 hours, senior aides at Buckingham Palace were alerted to a confidential development involving Prince Harry's U.S. residency status, one that directly contradicts the long-standing narrative of finality surrounding his departure from royal life. According to those briefed on the matter, Prince Harry has reportedly taken steps to distance himself from the permanence of his American legal position, triggering immediate concern inside royal legal circles. This was not framed as a public renunciation, sources stress, but as a strategic retreat, quiet, deliberate, and calculated to avoid headlines while opening a narrow door back to the United Kingdom. What has intensified the situation, insiders say, is the manner in which this move was communicated. It was not routed through media intermediaries nor through public representatives. Instead, it allegedly reached the palace through discreet legal channels, suggesting forethought and urgency. One source described it as a signal flare, not a surrender. The shock inside the institution was immediate. Senior courtiers reportedly questioned whether this maneuver risked reopening unresolved constitutional complications tied to titles, domicile, and eligibility under existing letters patent. Others focused on optics, how such a return, especially a solo one, would be interpreted by Parliament, the Privy Council, and a public already fatigued by years of royal discord. But the most destabilizing element, sources say, lies in what was left unsaid. The communication reportedly made no parallel assurances regarding Meghan, no mention of joint status, no indication of shared relocation. That omission, insiders claim, triggered an entirely different level of alarm, because within the monarchy, silence is rarely accidental. And when it comes to institutional risk, absence can speak louder than declaration. As emergency consultations reportedly began across Windsor Castle and Clarence House, one question dominated the discussion. What does Harry know that has made returning alone suddenly feel necessary? And more importantly, what mechanism is now being prepared to respond if this quiet plea becomes a public crisis? As the implications of Prince Harry's reported maneuver began to settle inside palace walls, attention shifted rapidly from emotion to mechanism. According to sources familiar with the response, the monarchy did not treat this as a sentimental appeal, but as a potential institutional breach, one that required immediate legal containment. Within hours, senior advisors were allegedly instructed to revisit dormant constitutional tools, rarely discussed outside closed-door briefings. At the center of these consultations, insiders say, were the letters patent of 1917 and subsequent amendments, documents that define not only titles but proximity to the crown, eligibility, and the conditions under which royal status can be recalibrated. While publicly symbolic, these instruments reportedly carry sharper internal consequences when questions of domicile, allegiance, and representation collide. Sources claim that legal teams tied to the Privy Council began quietly mapping scenarios. What happens if a senior royal seeks re-entry without a unified household? What precedent does it set if one half of a globally scrutinized couple is institutionally rehabilitated while the other remains outside the perimeter? And perhaps most critically, who absorbs the liability? Behind these questions lies a deeper concern. According to insiders, Prince Harry's U.S. residency status is not viewed in isolation. It intersects with security obligations, taxpayer exposure, and international perception. Any adjustment, however discreet, risks triggering parliamentary scrutiny, especially if public funds, protection arrangements, or diplomatic sensitivities are implicated. One source described the atmosphere as procedural, not punitive, but unforgiving. This is not about punishment, they stressed, it is about containment. The monarchy, as an institution, cannot afford ambiguity when it comes to loyalty, jurisdiction, and control. And then there is the matter of precedent. Sources say palace lawyers are acutely aware that any accommodation extended now could be cited in future disputes by other royals or by external actors seeking leverage. In that sense, Harry's request is not being weighed as a singular case, but as a test of institutional resilience. What complicates matters further, insiders allege, is the timing. This review is reportedly unfolding alongside unrelated but sensitive internal assessments tied to financial disclosures and overseas engagements. Threads that were once compartmentalized are now intersecting. And as one senior aide reportedly warned during a closed briefing, once legal instruments are activated, they do not pause for sentiment. They move forward until something breaks. What exactly those instruments are now beginning to uncover is the question driving the next phase of this crisis. As legal frameworks were quietly reactivated, sources say attention turned to documentation, paper trails, contractual disclosures, and communications that had until now been treated as peripheral. What emerged, according to insiders familiar with the review, was not a single explosive revelation, but a pattern, fragmented, deniable, yet deeply unsettling to those charged with protecting the crown. At the center of concern were allegedly undisclosed overlaps between Prince Harry's overseas arrangements and entities whose interests, sources say, do not neatly align with royal neutrality. Financial engagements, speaking contracts, and advisory relationships, previously defended as private enterprise, were reportedly re-examined through an institutional lens, not for legality alone, but for exposure. One source described the process as connecting dots that were never meant to sit on the same page. Individually, the arrangements raised few alarms. Collectively, they began to suggest vulnerabilities, points where personal ambition, public messaging, and constitutional distance blurred into something more precarious. More sensitive still, insiders claim, were internal memos referencing third-party intermediaries. These were not direct accusations, sources stress, but flags, notations indicating that certain communications had occurred outside established diplomatic or royal protocols. The concern was not what had been said, but who might now possess leverage as a result. And then there was Meghan. According to multiple sources, a parallel review focused on media-linked initiatives and philanthropic structures associated with her public profile. Again, no single violation was cited. But the cumulative effect raised questions about narrative control, monetization of royal proximity, and whether confidential access, past or perceived, had been indirectly capitalized upon. This is where the word betrayal began to circulate, not in formal minutes, but in hushed corridors. Betrayal not of individuals, but of expectation, of the implicit contract between crown and consort. That proximity would never become currency. What elevated concern into urgency, insiders say, was the discovery of time-bound clauses within certain agreements, clauses that activate disclosures, clauses that expire, clauses that, if triggered, could force information into the public domain under foreign jurisdictions. Suddenly, Harry's reported desire to return alone appeared less like nostalgia and more like insulation. As one senior figure allegedly remarked during a late-night briefing, this is no longer about whether he comes back, it's about what follows him if he does. And with at least one critical deadline now approaching, the institution faced a narrowing window to decide its next move. By the time dawn broke over Windsor, sources say the conversation inside the palace had shifted from analysis to urgency. What had initially been treated as a theoretical exposure was now framed as a race against time. At least one internal briefing, according to those with knowledge of its contents, included a stark assessment. Delays would no longer be neutral, they would be consequential. The pressure point, insiders claim, centered on a convergence of deadlines. Legal review windows tied to overseas contracts, immigration and residency recalibration timelines, and, most sensitive of all, internal reporting cycles that feed directly into parliamentary oversight mechanisms. None of these clocks were created by the monarchy, but all of them, sources say, could soon begin dictating its options. One source described the moment as procedural gravity. Once triggered, certain disclosures are not optional. They arrive as part of compliance, not negotiation. And according to those briefed, at least one such disclosure point is now measured in weeks, not months. This urgency reportedly reframed Prince Harry's quiet plea in a harsher light. What had been interpreted as a request began to look to some like a preemptive move, an attempt to reposition himself before external forces could do it for him. Returning alone, insiders suggest, may offer not reconciliation but jurisdictional shelter. The institutional dilemma is severe. If Harry's status shifts before these deadlines mature, the monarchy may gain leverage, control over narrative process and containment. If it does not, the crown risks being forced into a reactive posture, responding to revelations shaped elsewhere under rules it does not control. Complicating matters further, sources say, is the calendar. With senior royal engagements already locked and international attention intensifying, there is limited capacity to absorb another public rupture. Timing, in monarchy, is power, yet urgency has also exposed fault lines. Some advisors reportedly argue for caution, warning that accelerated decisions could fracture family bonds beyond repair. Others counter that legacy cannot be held hostage to sentiment, especially when institutional credibility is at stake. This internal division has sharpened into a single, unavoidable question: who decides when family becomes liability? As the clock ticks louder, attention is now turning away from legal instruments and toward bloodlines, toward inheritance, memory, and the unresolved legacy of those who came before. Because the next decision, sources say, will not be made by lawyers alone, it will be made by a family confronting its own history. When the discussion turned from deadlines to legacy, sources say the tone inside the palace shifted noticeably. Legal briefs were set aside, replaced by references to lineage, precedent, and the long memory of the crown. This was no longer just about Prince Harry's next move. It was about what his return, in any form, would symbolize within a dynasty that survives by continuity. At the center of this dilemma, insiders claim, is King Charles III himself. As monarch, he is bound to protect the institution. As father, he is bound to history's softer expectations. Sources say those two roles are now in direct conflict. Any accommodation offered to Harry risks being read as weakness. Any refusal risks cementing a generational fracture that could define Charles's reign. Senior figures reportedly revisited past moments of royal crisis, abdications, exiles, quiet reconciliations brokered far from public view. The lessons, they say, are unforgiving. When family disputes are mishandled, they do not fade, they calcify into cautionary tales. Particular attention has allegedly been paid to symbolic assets, residences like Sandringham House, archival access, and even ceremonial proximity during future state events. These are not merely properties or rituals, they are signals. Inclusion confers legitimacy. Exclusion sends a message that echoes for decades. Sources suggest there is also concern over inheritance, not in the crude financial sense, but in moral authority. What precedent does it set for the Prince of Wales for future heirs if institutional rules bend under private pressure? And how does that precedent play out when today's exception becomes tomorrow's expectation? Harry's reported willingness to return alone has complicated these calculations. Some insiders interpret it as an acknowledgement of boundaries. Others see it as a tactical division, an attempt to separate personal redemption from shared accountability. Either way, it forces the family to confront an uncomfortable truth. Unity can no longer be assumed. Behind closed doors, sources say, one phrase has been repeated with increasing frequency: the crown remembers longer than the heart. Decisions made now will be referenced long after current emotions cool. And as this legacy debate deepens, attention is shifting toward those best positioned to execute strategy without sentiment, the figures tasked with preserving authority when compromise becomes impossible. Because if family cannot resolve this, strategy must. With legacy questions unresolved and time continuing to compress, sources say the palace began preparing for outcomes rather than resolutions. This phase, insiders describe, is where sentiment gives way to structure. Quietly, methodically, authority started to move into position. According to those familiar with internal planning, Prince William has emerged as a central stabilizing force in these discussions, not as an antagonist, but as a custodian of future order. While King Charles III carries the weight of immediate decision, William is reportedly focused on long-term institutional survivability. His involvement, sources say, signals that this is no longer a temporary disturbance but a strategic inflection point. One countermove allegedly under consideration involves recalibrating access rather than issuing outright approvals or refusals. Partial reintegration, conditional presence, carefully worded allowances that preserve the appearance of family while withholding the substance of power. This approach, insiders suggest, allows the monarchy to maintain flexibility while signaling firmness. Simultaneously, palace officials are said to be reinforcing narrative boundaries, messaging protocols, engagement limits, clarifications about what does and does not constitute representation of the crown. These are not public statements, but internal lines drawn to prevent ambiguity from becoming exploitation. Another layer of strategy, sources claim, concerns timing. Any response to Harry's plea is reportedly being aligned with broader royal calendars to minimize disruption. The goal, insiders say, is to absorb shock quietly, distributing its impact across already established cycles of attention rather than allowing it to dominate the agenda. Yet the most consequential countermove may be financial in nature. According to multiple sources, advisors are reviewing exposure points, security funding, maintenance obligations, and long-term cost assumptions tied to overseas living. These reviews are not punitive but protective. The institution must know precisely what it is underwriting, because leverage in monarchy is rarely exerted through words. It is exerted through access, funding, and legitimacy. As one source reportedly put it, if emotion opened the door, structure will decide how far it swings. But as these strategies take shape, a harsher reality is emerging. Protection of authority often requires constriction, and constriction in turn creates pressure elsewhere, particularly in finances and resources that have long cushioned independence. Which is why the next phase of this unfolding drama will not be argued in briefing rooms, but felt in accounts, contracts, and costs that can no longer be deferred. As strategic frameworks hardened, sources say the practical consequences of those decisions began to surface, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. The concept of independence, long central to Prince Harry's post-royal identity, is now reportedly being tested not by ideology but by arithmetic. According to insiders, financial reviews tied to security, property, and contractual obligations have moved from abstract forecasting to immediate concern. Overseas security arrangements, once buffered by transitional allowances and private agreements, are said to be under renewed scrutiny. These costs, sources stress, do not diminish with distance, they compound with visibility. Property is another pressure point. Mortgages, maintenance, and long-term commitments associated with high-profile residences are allegedly being reassessed against income streams that are no longer guaranteed. Contracts signed during periods of peak attention may not carry the same value under current conditions, especially as institutional backing becomes more conditional. What has unsettled advisors most, insiders claim, is the convergence of these pressures. Financial strain rarely arrives alone. It brings reputational recalibration, renegotiation of terms, and reduced leverage with partners who once assumed permanence. Independence, when recalculated, begins to look provisional. Sources suggest that this strain has sharpened the logic behind Harry's reported desire to return alone. Re-entry into the royal fold, even at a reduced level, could stabilize certain variables: jurisdictional clarity, security alignment, and symbolic legitimacy that eases external negotiations. Alone, such stabilization is conceivable. Jointly, it becomes far more complex. There is also the matter of resource isolation. Without full institutional support, access to networks, legal, diplomatic, ceremonial, narrows. Each narrowing increases reliance on commercial frameworks that were never designed to carry royal scrutiny indefinitely. One advisor reportedly summarized the moment bluntly: this is where autonomy meets its invoice. As financial pressure builds, so does psychological weight. Decisions once framed as values-driven are now filtered through survival calculus. The question is no longer what is wanted, but what can be sustained. And as these pressures accumulate, sources say the atmosphere around Harry has shifted from defiant to constrained. Isolation, once chosen, is now being felt, which sets the stage for the most volatile phase yet. Not external conflict, but internal siege, where stress reshapes judgment and urgency overrides patience. By this stage, sources say the crisis had moved beyond boardrooms and balance sheets and into the realm of psychological endurance. The accumulation of legal uncertainty, financial pressure, and institutional distance has reportedly created an atmosphere of siege, one that is reshaping decision-making in real time. According to those close to the situation, Prince Harry is now operating under layered constraints. Each option appears to close another door. Delay increases exposure. Action invites scrutiny. Silence breeds speculation. In such conditions, even routine choices begin to feel existential. Insiders describe a narrowing circle of trusted advisors, a common symptom when pressure intensifies. Information becomes filtered, perspectives harden. The risk, sources say, is not panic, but miscalculation. Under siege, strategies can become reactive, driven by short-term relief rather than long-term stability. This psychological compression is reportedly mirrored within the palace itself. Officials tasked with managing the fallout are said to be operating under continuous alert, anticipating external triggers that could force disclosure or public response. The system, once designed for ceremony and continuity, is now braced for disruption. What makes this moment particularly volatile, insiders claim, is the moral dimension creeping into strategic calculus. Advisors are no longer debating only what can be done, but what should be done, and whether those two answers still align. Compassion and caution are colliding. For Harry, the isolation is reportedly acute. The distance from familiar structures, rituals, and reference points has removed stabilizing context. Independence, once framed as liberation, now carries the weight of solitary accountability. There is no buffer between decision and consequence. One source described the mood starkly. When the institution steps back, the silence becomes deafening. This is the point at which narratives harden, either toward reconciliation or rupture. Under siege, choices accelerate, windows close, and the margin for error narrows to almost nothing. As psychological strain peaks, the final phase approaches, one that will frame this episode not just as a family conflict, but as a moral referendum on duty, responsibility, and the cost of separation. Because what happens next will not be judged only by outcomes, but by the reasons given for them. As the hours stretch into days, sources say the palace is preparing not only for operational decisions, but for a broader reckoning, a moment when principle, precedent, and public perception converge. This is the stage at which the monarchy evaluates not merely actions, but their moral weight, and determines which choices will endure in history. King Charles III, insiders report, faces a dual responsibility: to safeguard the institution and to navigate the personal complexities of a son whose choices have repeatedly tested both law and legacy. According to those briefed, the monarch is weighing every option against the long shadow of letters patent, the expectations of Parliament, and the scrutiny of a global public that watches for signs of weakness as closely as for signs of compassion. Decisions are being calibrated to send clear signals about authority, boundaries, and the consequences of unilateral action, without igniting a crisis that could compromise decades of careful stewardship. At the same time, Prince Harry's reported appeal to return alone has become a symbol of tension between autonomy and accountability. Sources emphasize that this is more than a personal journey. It is an institutional test. Every step he takes is measured against precedent. Every word is parsed for implications, and every private intention is scrutinized for public consequence. This, insiders stress, is where the monarchy asserts its most potent lesson. Liberty within the institution is conditional, accountability is unavoidable, and silence can be as revealing as confession. What happens in the next weeks, whether reintegration, restriction, or continued separation, will define not only individual futures, but the broader architecture of royal governance. For viewers, the takeaway is as instructive as it is dramatic. Even those closest to power are bound by rules larger than themselves. Influence has limits, autonomy carries costs, and legacy is shaped not just by decisions, but by the timing and context in which they are made. As palace sources caution, history is watching. The monarchy endures, but its members are never free from the institutions they serve or from the consequences of challenging them. For our audience, the question remains, what does loyalty mean when family, duty, and legacy collide? And how will the next chapter of this unprecedented drama unfold? Keep following for the latest updates as the story continues to develop behind the walls of Windsor, Sandringham, and beyond.